So welcome to the June 2023 office hours. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about progress reviews. Note that we're using various trademarks that are owned by the Eclipse Foundation, and many of them are registered. Some are not. We use trademarks in a number of different ways. The Eclipse Foundation manages a fairly extensive trademark portfolio on behalf of our projects and other efforts that are happening here. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Eclipse PAHO project. Find out more about the Eclipse PAHO project, which is one of our flagship IoT projects. Great stuff. Go have a look if you're interested in messaging and IoT. So, like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit today about progress reviews, and those of you who've been around for a little while will probably would be familiar with release reviews. Progress reviews and release reviews are basically the same thing. They differ primarily in timing. Generally, release reviews tend to occur just before a release. Progress reviews can be scheduled at any time. They are the same in that following a progress or a release review, the project can then do releases for an entire year. The idea is that the review gives the EMO an opportunity to have a look at what the project is doing. It gives the PMCs an opportunity to look at what the projects are doing, make recommendations on how the projects might better operate in the open source context. And it does give us an opportunity to make sure that our committers are meeting the obligations that the Eclipse development process and the intellectual property due diligence process require. As noted on this slide here, you've probably seen the PMI. If you are a committer and you go to projects.eclipse.org and navigate to your projects page, you'll see on the right side a collection of commands that are at your disposal. Things to do like nominate a committer. This is a little bit old. We'll have to update the intellectual property section. Is actually a little out of date on this slide. But if you look way down at the bottom, for releases, there's an ability to create a progress review, and that gives the EMO and then contact the EMO and Maria Teresa, Boris, or I will help you through that process. So when we engage in a progress review, we're, again, like I said, looking for just how do we help what can we do to help the project engage in practices that will be to their benefit in the open source context. We also do look at the intellectual property tracking to make sure that the project teams are engaging as required in our due diligence process. We look for things like, is the project doing planning in an open and transparent manner? Are they, is the project operating in such a way that will invite participation and contribution and diversification of the contributors? We'll note, and we say it 3 times on this slide, so clearly it's important. The IP policy must be observed for all releases. Intellectual property must be resolved by the due diligence process before it is included in any release. So regardless of the state at the time of a progress review, it may be the case that intellectual property may not have all been reviewed. What we're looking for primarily is that the project team is following the processes and understands how to engage with our intellectual property due diligence process. And with that understanding, with the review, we're looking again to see that they understand and know what they're doing. By the time it comes to actually pushing out releases, those releases should contain fully vetted intellectual property. I'll take a sidestep and note that the rules are a little bit different for specification projects. If you were engaged in a project that's doing specification development, a release review is required for every single major or minor release of your specification. There's various reasons for that. The intellectual property flows are a little bit different, and we have to manage them a little bit more carefully. One of the things that you'll see us harp on quite a lot, and I will likely use these words very frequently in this conversation and in other conversations, as our open source rules of engagement. These are documented in the Eclipse Foundation Development Process, which basically uses exactly these words. The open source rules of engagement are that projects are required to operate in an open, transparent, and meritocratic manner. I tend to think of these in a slightly different order. Transparent is easy to think about. The idea with transparency is that you're using a public issue tracker, and I mean actually using it. So that's one of the things that we would look for, is to make sure that a project during a progress review, we would look to make sure that a project is actually using a public, the public issue tracker that's provided to them by the Eclipse Foundation, and interacting with their community, responding to issues that have been opened is one of those things that we would look for. Transparency also takes the form of holding conversations on public forums where possible, using archives to capture minutes, just basically letting your community know what you're doing. We tend to think of open, or we do think of open as being different from transparent. There's some definitions where you can think of these as being exactly the same thing. By open, we mean open to participation. We mean that you give up any notion of absolute control and allow others to join your open source project. It's more than just allow. We actually look for Eclipse open source projects to encourage participation by others. I'll note that open does not mean that you absolutely have to accept input into your project from just anybody. What it means is everybody has to play by the same set of rules. If somebody drops 10 million lines of code on you, you don't have to actually accept it. That's a pretty big ask. 10 million lines of code arriving without some promise of contributors and people, development resources to maintain it is just not fair. If contributions are out of scope or of insufficient quality, these are big reasons that a project team could decide not to accept contributions. The thing, what we look for though is you can't say this person works for the wrong company, or we're not working, this is our competitive rival in the marketplace, so we're not going to accept their contributions. We would consider that to be offside. We would like ideally that committers are spending at least some of their Eclipse time working with well-meaning contributors. Engaging with contributors is one of those things that's, and you'll hear me use this term a lot, in your selfish best interests. The idea being that, balancing your, we appreciate that balancing your scarce time, writing code and helping others to write code is going to be an ongoing struggle, but we hope that the committers are able to engage with people who do show up to the project. But I'll try to defer that discussion for another time. The third is merit. What constitutes merit varies by project and can be a bit hand-wavy. The low bar is that the contributor must have made at least a couple of contributions that have been accepted by the project team. How the bar is set really varies by team. Again, who the candidate works for should not be a determining factor. If somebody is destined to be a committer, it is relatively easy to have them create a small number of merge or pull requests to demonstrate merit for the community. It is also relatively easy for a committer to accept those contributions. If it's not relatively easy, then maybe that person shouldn't be a committer. Is just some thoughts in terms of that. Again, this is a part of a much larger conversation that's a little out of scope for today. So what do we look for when we're doing a progress review? So there is in the Eclipse Foundation Project Handbook, and I've got a link to it down at the bottom of this slide, and you'll find links to it in every communication we have with committers. It has a checklist for what projects should be doing. This checklist was actually originally developed by the technology PMC. This is something that they originally used as they were going through the review process with their various projects. We grabbed that and evolved it somewhat. Pardon me. So the checklist is there in the handbook. Again, what we're looking for is the project actually operating within the mission and scope of the top level project, and indeed within its own scope. Sometimes projects will take on things that are not really within their scope, and we encourage in those cases either maybe it's time to rethink what the mission and scope of the project is, or maybe it's time to think about starting a separate project. These are kind of things you just want to actually it happens relatively rarely, but it is one of the things we look for. We looked at the projects are implementing the open source rules of engagement, and that takes various forms I'll talk about as we go through. We looked at all content has been vetted through our IP due diligence process. Note that I talk about vetting through the process. Committers play an important role in our IP due diligence process. We have an IP team that's there to help, but part of the process, and this is described in the handbook as well, is that committers use a certain amount of judgment. We have the tools, and I'll talk a little bit about the Dash license tool again today. We have some tools that help with this. Ultimately, we don't need everything vetted by the IP team. We just need to make sure that everything has been vetted through the process, again, of which you are a part. I'll talk more about that later. We require that we also look to make sure that projects are correct using trademarks. And this is both our trademarks and the trademarks of others. This is one of those things that is just sort of good citizen of the world stuff. I'll point out that the checklist is not a test. We're not looking for a score. We're not using it to score. We think of the checklist as a set of guidelines, things that you should be doing, and we don't expect anyone's going to be hitting 100%. Even the projects that we run, I'm trying to decide if I think the Dash project itself would hit 100% on the checklist. We actually try to implement all of the practices in the Eclipse Dash project, but I think even it's probably missing one or two. It might be worth having a look. We want to make sure that the project is on side with regard to the Eclipse development process, and we want to make sure that the intellectual property due diligence process is being followed. But most of the checklist is concerned with engaging in practices that are in the project's selfish best interests. When I use that selfish best interests, again, we believe that the practices we describe are good practices for doing vendor neutral, commercial friendly open source. So when I say selfish best interests, sometimes it might not be obvious. Sometimes there are practices that may not seem obvious, but again, these are practices that we believe are valuable and good, and we want you to believe that too, and encourage, in many cases, encourage you to adopt the practices. It's worth pointing out that we tend to look a little harder. We tend to spend a little bit more time with projects that are new or that we don't hear from all that often. Our main focus is to ensure that projects are on a good path. We believe that our open source rules of engagement define a solid working model for vendor neutral, commercial, friendly open source. Conversely, we don't tend to look all that hard at projects that have been around for a while, that we engage with frequently, and through experience have demonstrated that they know what they're doing. There's a handful of projects where projects that have been around for a while kind of know what they're doing, and we try not to bother people any more than we need to. And again, projects that are new and starting up, we tend to take a little bit more interest and try to provide some more guidance. I'll reiterate that we don't expect Eclipse open source projects to accept every contribution that comes their way. We don't expect you to engage with every contributor who sends you a merge or a pull request. We do believe, though, that it is in your selfish best interest, there I use that term again, to engage with well-meaning contributors and turn them into committers. So we're looking for evidence of the attempt. Like everything else we check, we're checking to confirm that the project is doing the right sorts of things to help the community engage. We don't check every single corner. Your project should be buildable, and because people come into your project that want to contribute, having them be able to be successful building is good. So we don't look at every build in your project. We don't look at every repository. Some projects have 100 repositories. We just don't have the kind of resources to go through and build absolutely everything. But we do actually try to locally build projects where possible. And, based on that experience, we may provide some feedback. When a build is not obvious, right? So if we see a POM file in the root of a repository, we just Maven verify that POM file and see what happens. If that doesn't work, then we'll look a little harder for build instructions in your README or your contributing file. Again, if your build is not obvious or not simple, then document it. One of the things we've been experimenting, and we're experimenting with different tools that investigate code and kind of look for dependencies and do some automatic scanning of dependencies. Automatically engage in the due diligence process. It's worth noting that when your build is relatively straightforward, when you have a Maven POM file, for example, that can just be Maven verified to run, that makes it easier for tools to deal with it, and makes it more likely that we would be successful with tools. Just a point, if your build is complicated and requires multiple steps, chances are we're not going to be able to help you with any automation today or in the future. Again, with intellectual property due diligence, we're looking primarily during a progress review to review your practices. Where possible, we will try to identify third-party content and confirm that licenses are valid. We do at this point, we'll spend some time validating license compatibility. This is an ongoing challenge. It's relatively. In many cases, it's relatively straightforward to identify the licenses of content. Deciding whether two different licenses actually work together is a little bit harder. And we do tend to spend a little bit of time looking at that. We spend most of our, a little bit of time is not the right way of phrasing it. It's at the point of a progress review that we would be looking for funky combinations of licenses. And that's something that's, again, relatively hard, but, we count on some help from the committers to do that as well. Just a couple words about the Dash license tool. You've probably heard about it. You may have actually used it. The Dash license tool is something that we use where possible. In fact, it was developed, at least in part, as a tool that we were using for checking intellectual property due diligence during these reviews. It's a tool that's designed to assist with license identification. It happens to do a really good job a lot of the time. In fact, I would say most of the time, based on our experience. It's particularly good with Maven builds. If you have a package lock file or a yarn lock file, these work really well. We have some code snippets that you can use, some CLI invocations of this tool that will help you vet Python dependencies that are accessed through the PyPy. repository. There's examples on how to vet content for Rust through Cargo and other technologies. Basically, if a technology has a repository, a notion of a software repository or a software manager, dependency manager, that has a means of identifying dependencies, we can usually use the Dash license tool to help determine the licenses of the content that your project is leveraging. But Dash only knows what you tell it. It doesn't have intelligence to go in and find dependencies. That's not what it does. We leverage dependency managers. Now, again, not entirely true. The Maven plugin that comes with it uses the Maven reactor. So Maven reactor is actually good at discovering dependencies, and so it does a particularly good job there. We depend on committers. We still depend on committers to understand the dependencies in their content. If you're doing funky things in your build, like pulling down zip files and extracting a single file out of that and including it in your binary that you distribute, none of these tools will detect that. That's where we need your assistance, and we would need you to be interacting with the IP team and identifying those cases so that we can make sure that the intellectual property is fully and properly vetted. So again, Dash also doesn't understand how licenses are combined. It will identify that you're using EPL content and Apache content, but it won't necessarily know or won't have any idea which order you're using them in or whether that order makes any sense. Just all of this to say is the tool is a tool. The tool is designed to help with this process, but please never say, but the tool told me this was okay. We also look at branding and trademarks. So we're looking particularly at like project websites, and we're looking at README files to make sure that we're using the trademarks correctly. We're also looking to make sure you're not violating trademarks owned by other people. This is just, again, like I said earlier, good citizen kind of stuff, right? The whole notion of trademarks is that these are terms that others are using in their trade, and we need to make sure that we do not confuse who owns trademarks. And again, we try to provide some assistance to make sure that project teams get this right, because it's hard. We have a full-time trademark staff member who registers trademarks and defends our trademarks, but she's also available to help us understand how to use other people's trademarks. Again, just good citizenship stuff. We have some requirements for legal documentation that we look for during a progress review. So we're looking certainly for a README file. This is, again, just kind of good citizen stuff. This is the sort of thing that people expect. Back years and years and years ago, when we first started doing this, repositories would be over here, issues would be over there, information about the project would be in yet another place. This was just the nature of things because nothing was integrated, and as we provided services, we pulled all sorts of stuff together. There's a little bit of that old school mentality still in some of our projects, and we're trying. This is one of those areas where maybe some of the older projects need a little bit more attention. Expectations today are that basically everything is in the same place. Everything is in the repository. So we have GitHub and we have GitLab. They have issue trackers. They have there's this practice now that every repository has a README. Every repository has its license information in the root file, the root directory, pardon me. Code of conduct is something that's relatively new, but for the last year or two, there has been a community expectation that a code of conduct exists in a repository. And in fact, GitHub, for example, will detect a lot of these files and do special things with them, like make the code of conduct known when you are making a pull request, for example. Yes, you can actually put the code of conduct file into your GitHub organizations.github repository if you choose to share it across all of your repositories. We require a notice file. This may take different forms. Some projects use the dependencies file that's created by the Dash license tool. Eclipse platform technology, projects that are building plugins and features will use the plugin about.html standard to satisfy this requirement. Generally, we're looking for in a notices file a declaration of the project licenses. Licenses of prerequisite third-party content. That one's a little bit harder to do, but we do look for try and get that as close as we can. And where a project is engaged in cryptography, we look for a cryptography statement. This is important to us. That this is helpful. One of the things that we do for Eclipse projects is that we make sure that we report the use of cryptography to the various governments that care about that sort of thing. The US government in particular needs to be notified of the inclusion of cryptography in content that's produced and distributed. And again, we do this basically on behalf, quietly, silently, without much ceremony on behalf of the projects every month. So having that cryptography statement there, if you use cryptography, helps us help you. Over the next little while, you'll see some changes in our recommendations regarding notice files, just so heads up. I expect that they will take a different form or maybe phased out completely in favor of SBOMs. We're seeing SBOMs, again, SBOMs are something that we've talked about in the past that there's a great deal of interest in. And again, we see this as being actually more useful than a notice file. One of our challenges with intellectual property due diligence is that notice files or third-party content lists, license files and stuff are not necessarily as useful as you might think they are while doing intellectual property due diligence. Keeping these correct and up to date is apparently a big challenge. And again, there's not a lot of rigor in terms of, do these in third-party content, do notice files necessarily reflect the content of the actual content we're looking for, or are they from a larger work and kind of just shared across components that make up that larger work? Anyway, so SBOMs have potential to be far more useful, being machine readable and far more precise in terms of what they define. We're doing an awful lot of work to try and make SBOMs be the standard moving forward. We look for a contributing file. Contributing file should contain a reference to the Eclipse contributor agreement, along with instructions for contribution for those people who do show up to your project and want to make contributions. It should have a reference to the Eclipse Foundation terms of use. It should have pointers to canonical repositories and issue trackers and channels and all that. Some indication of a project plan, indications of how to build, and just generally how to engage with the project team. Project plans are typically informal, so we're not looking for a formal project plan, but a lot of projects will use their issue tracker for planning. So having some level of sophistication, some way of identifying issues that are of current interest or are currently being worked on, having a means of having the community actually understand what the focus of the project is and give them an opportunity to participate in both the planning process and in the implementation of those plans. Again, just because somebody shows up to a planning meeting doesn't mean you have to accept their ideas, but having some provision or allowing well-meaning contributors to participate in the process is something that we look for and we believe is in the interests of the project. We look for a security file that describes pointer to the security policy, the Eclipse Foundation security policy, which you can find at eclipse.org/security. There is we look for the file to describe what is actually supported for vulnerability mitigation, right? So if somebody shows up and says, "Hey, we found a vulnerability in this 7-year-old release of your project," it's perfectly reasonable to not patch that necessarily or suggest that they use a more recent version of the project. But in some cases, project teams do decide that they, for example, will support vulnerability patches for the last 3 releases. It really depends on the nature of the project, the nature of the adopters of that project, and the community that's formed around the project. So we look for the project team to just make explicit what they actually do support. I'll talk a little bit about this as we wrap up, but one of the things we want project teams to be thinking about is it's actually okay to have vulnerabilities in your code and report them through MITRE, create CVEs for your issues. And we encourage projects to do that. It's actually seen as a sign of quality in a project that you've actually had issues and addressed them and disseminated information about the vulnerabilities to the community. So that hypothetical 7-year-old release that has a vulnerability, you may not patch that release, but we would likely encourage creating a CVE to make sure that anybody using that would be aware of the problem. Just because you know about a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean that we can fix it. There is a documentation generator that builds most of the files that I've talked about before. The other thing that the documentation generator does is it displays information that we've gathered about the existence of all of the files that I've just described. So here I'm showing the Dash license tools documentation generator page. And the table here is showing that we've got in all of our repositories, we've got all of the files that we tend to look for. You'll see a red X here. A red X is not the end of the world. Again, most of these are just strong recommendations. We do need you to have a license file. We do need you to have a contributing file. If things are missing, these are things that we would expect to work with the project team to help fill in the gaps. Note that this table is created using data that comes from a database that is updated daily. It's actually updated overnight. So if you do make changes in your repository, those changes won't be reflected until the next day. The documentation generator does things like generate copyright headers that you can use. It does a pretty good job on relatively simple licensing. As soon as if you have a project that lists 5 possible licenses, this generator does a pretty terrible job on that. But it's there, and again, for the most part, it does work. The documentation generator itself has got a number of caveats around it. Just pay attention to those. The last thing that we're looking for is just generally keeping project metadata up to date. We do have, I've mentioned the PMI. We capture metadata. We actually use that metadata. A lot of the metadata in the PMI falls into the category of help us, help you. We use the description of the project in communication. I had recently the marketing team brought the newsletter to me, and we want to talk about this project in the newsletter, and we went to the metadata and we just couldn't find a really good description from there. So I've talked to the project team and I'm trying to get them to, update their metadata with a good description of their project that we can use to just tell people about them. This also takes the form of build information and, technical metadata. So POM XML files, package.json files have means of specifying project licenses and where to find the project, how to communicate with the project, those kinds of things. We would look as well at, those kinds of things. Opportunistically, we look at those. Keeping that up to date is just in your best interest, and again, helps people find you and helps people contribute to your project and work with you. I'm going to wrap up relatively quickly. We recommend the use of reuse. All of the Dash project repositories say all of that repositories use this. The idea is that every single file in the repository has license information associated with it. Reuse provides means of annotating image files and JSON files, for example, with license information. This just makes it so that we have a much more we're providing a much more complete picture of the licensing within our content. Other resources, I've mentioned the handbook. That's kind of a good resource. It's intended as a resource to help you figure out how to do specific things. I strongly recommend that you do not try to read it front to back. You'll likely just hurt yourself. The committer training videos are something that we look at periodically and re-record every once in a while to try and make sure that they're up to date. They cover things like committer elections, just starting your new project. Like I said at the beginning of this, I'm actually going to turn much of this content into a how do we do progress reviews video. These are all relatively short, easy videos to process through. Some parting thoughts. We are still evolving some best practices that we are going to be rolling out hopefully shortly to projects. We're kind of incrementally rolling out SBOM generation. We're exploring the use of various tools. As I mentioned previously, in previous presentations, and I guess in this presentation as well, keeping your project metadata up to date is an important part of this, and will certainly make generating SBOMs an awful lot easier. If we have license information in your POM files, using a Maven-based plugin to generate an SBOM for your project will wind up with a more complete and correct SBOM. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, so I won't harp on this too much now, but security is something that's becoming increasingly important to the community, to our adopters, to all of the different commercial interests that we work with, and governments. So we've been involved with the MITRE for some time. We've been a CNA, a CVE numbering authority with MITRE for many years. So we do have the ability to escalate vulnerability reports. And as I said, it's important that you think about this in the right way. Creating a CVE is a bit of a rite of passage for an open source project. It's a good thing for a project to have a couple of CVEs. It's an indication that people care enough to have discovered vulnerabilities and reported them to you. We talk about responsible disclosure of it. So the idea is if somebody is using your software and there is a vulnerability in there that could affect them, whether we are able to patch it or not, they need to find out about it. And the way that most people find out about vulnerabilities is through the CVE database or the databases that are created from that. NIST, for example, uses CVE information for their database. Projects like OWASP, the GitHub, Dependabot, all use this information to identify vulnerabilities and help people fix them. So again, if there's a vulnerability, whether or not you can fix it, creating a CVE is a good thing. With that, that's actually the end of the formal portion that I wanted to present. I'm going to stop the recording and invite questions.